This video introduces the XEntity. This entity consists of software modules created within the brain simulator, forming a very simple basis for intelligent actions. The XEntity is written with an eye to creating any number of senses and intelligent features, and even replacing the simulated environment with real-world robotic senses and controls. If you've been following along with my previous material, you know that any AGI must be included in an entity with the ability to sense and act in a real-world environment. Further, actions it takes must have an effect on the environment which the entity can then sense, so that it can learn from its successes and mistakes. I call this the XEntity because although we know some external characteristics, we're not sure of its internal workings. The XEntity could be a robot running in a real-world environment, but real environments present two problems for early-stage AGI development. First, the real world is so complex that it is difficult to isolate individual characteristics. Although it's relatively easy to implement vision and hearing, for example, then the AGI is bombarded by a continuous flood of incoming information. And second, it can be very difficult to create repeatable results with a real-world robot. The solution is to create a simulated environment for our XEntity. To get started with the XEntity, I wanted to create the simplest entity I could imagine with just a single sense and a single behavior, and place it in the simplest possible simulated environment. So, I created two new modules within the brain simulator, one being the entity itself, and one being the simulator for the environment in which the entity exists, senses, and acts. Previously, I created brain simulator modules for a video camera and for simulating a three-dimensional environment. But for the XEntity, I have reduced the simulator to 2 dimensions for ease of experimentation, with the intention of going back to 3 dimensions once the entity has more complex behaviors. Whether any intelligence whatsoever can be demonstrated in only 2 dimensions remains to be seen. Initially, the entity moves about within the simulated environment and can turn one way or another based on random numbers. This entity has no sensations at all, and we can watch the entity move about randomly within the limits of its environment. When we add some random obstacles to the environment, the entity meanders around and bumps into obstacles. The entity cannot pass through obstacles. This is the only physics I have included in the simulator at this time. Now let's give the entity the ability to sense a single characteristic in the environment. I've chosen that it can sense its proximity to green obstacles. You can think of green obstacles as emitting an aroma which can be sensed at a distance. At the same time, I added a slight change to the entity's behavior. If the strength of the aroma is increasing, do not turn. If the strength of the aroma remains the same, turn slightly. If the green aroma is decreasing, turn sharper. With this very simple sense and single behavior, the XEntity now appears to be attracted to green obstacles, which you can see from its path over time. Finally, I added a single characteristic of environmental feedback. When the entity is in contact with a green obstacle, the obstacle is reduced in size. Eventually, the environment runs out of green and the entity reverts to random motion. Now we can imagine that our entity considers green to be an edible food source. It can smell the food, is attracted to it, and consumes it. By looking at the code, we know that the XEntity is a purely reactive system with no ability to learn, plan, or be aware of anything. But looking at its behavior, it's easy to imagine that it is much more complex than it actually is. That it could be a primitive life form which likes to eat green. With only a single sense, this entity is analogous to, but is even simpler than the single-celled paramecium, which can be sensitive not only to aroma, but to light, temperature, acidity, and perhaps other concerns as well. As I add more senses to the entity, along with the abilities to learn and plan, the entity's limitations will become less obvious and less clear-cut. The XEntity will appear even more purposeful and perhaps even intelligent. I hope you'll stay tuned for future videos on this channel to watch how the XEntity development progresses. For more on this timely topic, read my new book, Will Computers Revolt? Preparing for the Future of Artificial Intelligence. Available now at Amazon and book retailers worldwide in paperback, hardcover, and ebook editions.